Okay, great. Welcome back. All right, so we have learned in the first half of this lecture that nobody can be an expert on everything. And we have to figure out how we're going to assess a scientific claim, like the claim that the planet is warming and it's due to the effects that humans have had on the climate system and so on. And we've learned that trusting the opinion of experts is going to, in general, be your best option. What makes an expert? I mean, how do we decide who's an expert and why? Experts have to demonstrate a particular level of expertise on a very specific topic. How do they do that? Well, the book provides a handful of ways that you kind of guidance on that. One is that, of course, they have to have the highest level of education. Most of the time, someone who is a true expert, like a court case would allow them to come in as an expert witness, requires them to have the highest level of education that's available in that discipline. Most of the time, that's some kind of doctorate. Whether we're talking like a medical expert who would have an MD, or a scientist who would have a PhD or something like that. That doesn't mean that lower levels of education are unimportant. I mean, presumably most of the people taking this class are working on their bachelor's degree. Bachelor's degrees are important. They are even if that's your terminal degree, if that's the final degree that you get, that doesn't mean that those are unimportant, but those kinds of degrees are largely about getting the tools for solving problems, the techniques, learning the terminology, learning the fundamentals. They aren't necessarily about becoming an expert on whatever it is you end up majoring in. Okay, over your course of your career, you might become some kind of expert, but that would be a different. I mean, that's not what a bachelor's degree is about. A bachelor's degree is about developing the fundamentals. Your research has to be in a very specific topic if you're going to be considered an expert. Let's talk about, like, for example, about that situation again with a lump in the throat. Would you ask somebody who has a PhD in chemistry to look at your lump in your throat? I mean, tumors are caused by the biochemistry going on inside of the nucleus of cells. I mean, it's all chemistry, right? Gosh, Dr. So-and-so, she's a really good chemist. I'll have her look at it. Well, no, of course not. I mean, knowing a lot about chemistry doesn't tell you anything about how lumps work in your throat, okay? It has to be very specific. In the study of climate, for example, I mean, lots of people who express expert opinions on climate may even have PhDs in topics like atmospheric science or environmental science or something like that, but don't necessarily have that level of expertise in the subject of climate change. I mean, they might be much more detailed about some other aspect of atmospheric science. A tornado chaser might have no particular information about how climate is changing, okay? Or a desert meteorologist, or a weather forecaster, or something like that. They might be wonderful experts in those things, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have this level to be considered an expert in the subject of climate change. You need to write if you're an expert. And in particular, you need to be writing things that are for other experts to use and to read and to get informed by. We're going to actually talking later in the semester about publishing and so on and how that all works. But I want you to understand, just because you've written something doesn't mean you're an expert on it. It needs to be something that is written for and used by other experts. And I went to my bookshelf, just a second here, to give you an example. I mean, these days, anybody can publish, okay? You get some money from somebody who has a political opinion and you can find somebody who will pay for you to publish. I found this book on my shelf. It is The Mad, Mad, Mad World of Climatism. I don't even remember who sent me this piece of junk. But it is a book, and I'm sure Steve Gorham, whoever Steve Gorham is, believes that he is some kind of person that people should be consulting on the subject of climate change. And as you can probably guess by the fact that the name of the book is The Mad, Mad, Mad World of Climatism, this guy does not in any way believe in climate change. And he's got this book here. And I'm sure that he tells people he wrote books about climate change and how climate change is all a hoax and all this kind of stuff. Real scientific publications don't have cartoons in them. They don't have little boxes off to the side that have things like wacky climate change headlines. They don't have, look, they have, I don't think you can see it here, but they have like a camel in the crosshairs for some reason. I don't understand what that's all about. Shocking discovery with a picture of here, panic in the streets. This is clear. If the polar bears driving the convertible on the cover didn't convince you that this is not a scientific book that is used by experts, certainly even just opening it up, not to mention things like there's no references, there's no index so you can find parts of it. This is not a legitimate piece of scholarly work here, okay? This does not qualify this person as an expert. On the other hand, just to grab another example here, I grabbed impacts of the global change on hydrologic cycle of West Africa and Northwest Africa. Okay, if I haven't mentioned it before, that's actually my specialty. I am actually I study the climate and weather of West Africa. Okay, it's a long story as to why I do West Africa stuff, but that's another day. But I mean, look, this book is full of scientific figures and equations and satellite imagery, and every few pages there's a whole bunch of references. There's schematic diagrams as to how the climate system works. There's statistical results. This isn't even a textbook. This is a book experts in the field of West and Northwest African climate use to refer to, like to look up who is studying different aspects of the climate. If you have questions, you need to consult somebody who's spending more time on the on agriculture and water use. You can look it up in here and see what their work is about and so on. Okay, this is obviously a very different kind of book than something with polar bears driving a convertible on the cover. Okay, one of these books is written by experts and for experts. One of them is a piece of garbage. Another thing that you have to do in order to be an expert is you have to have up-to-date knowledge. The leading edge of knowledge evolves very, very quickly. If you don't keep up to date, you very quickly are no longer an expert in what's going on. If you're retired, or in the world of universities, they often call that emeritus faculty, even if you were an expert during your career, very quickly your knowledge becomes obsolete. You would not be considered an expert, like an expert witness in a court of law. You would not be an expert on lots of different contexts. Experts who are retired or emeritus may have information about like the context or the historical setting of different kinds of research projects, but that's something altogether different. Let me give you an example of how this can all go very, very wrong. From time to time, some political action committee or some special interest group will organize where a group of scientists will write editorials and sign it saying that climate change isn't real, or that it's not caused by humans, or that it's all a big hoax, or whatever. And I have an example of that here. This is a reprint of an open letter to the United Nations Secretary General saying that current scientific knowledge does not substantiate the assertions on weather and climate. And it's signed by 125 scientists. It's a reprint from the Financial Post. I provided a link there, follow that shortcut link there, and you can go and see this article yourself, but it's pretty much the kind of garbage you think it is, okay? They're basically just saying, hey, climate change didn't happen, it isn't happening, it's all a big hoax, blah, 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 this is inconsistent with the facts, don't be getting all excited about climate change. And these kind of things, I don't know, once every few months or so, somebody takes out an open letter to the United Nations Secretary General in the New York Times, and these same 125 some odd scientists will sign it. Or an open letter to the president, and it'll be in the Washington Post or something. Now, as it happens, okay, so in this particular version, all 125 of the scientists, they showed their credentials and so on here at the bottom. Now, as it happens, I actually know a lot of these people, and not a lot, but a number of these people, and some of them have since changed their minds about these things, and some of these people got in trouble either in the press or with their universities for signing these kinds of letters. And so, in the interest of being diplomatic, I have grayed their names out for a video that's in YouTube here. But I gave you the link. If you want to go back and look up who these people are and stuff like that, I can't stop you. Okay, but in the interest of being diplomatic, I actually covered up the names. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go through the credentials of a few of these people to give you a sense of what's wrong. And just to be fair about it, I just took the first 8, okay? I just made one screenshot here of the first 8 people to sign this letter here. Okay, the first person here, he is a mathematician and astrophysicist. Does a mathematician and an astrophysicist have years of experience working in climate change and publishing books about climate change that are used by other scientists in climate change? No. Okay. This person is interesting, I'm sure, very well educated, but clearly has no particular knowledge about climate change. Here is somebody who is a physicist, not a climate scientist or anything, and he's emeritus, so who knows how long he's been retired and out of the loop of like papers and books and talks and things like that up on the subject, latest research, latest data sets, who knows? Long time probably. Here's somebody who is a physicist, okay, again, no particular reason this person has any knowledge about climate information or whatsoever. This person's a professor of marketing. You can go and decide for yourself how valuable that is for their knowledge of climate. This person is an environmental consultant and former climatology professor. That could be something. Probably not. Former climatology professor could be a good thing, but the word former there spooks me a little bit. Like, is he retired? Did he lose his job? I don't know what the story of that person is. And an environmental consultant, I mean, anybody can be a consultant. That doesn't necessarily mean this person has any particular knowledge of climate. Notice he doesn't actually tell us what his degree is in. I would be worried about this one a lot. This person is a chemist, and he's emeritus. So, or she, I don't remember who this person is. No particular reason I think this person's keeping up with chemistry, much less having any knowledge about climate change. It's not a climate scientist. This person has a background in earth science. Okay, earth science is typically, when someone writes earth science as their degree, that usually means things like volcanoes, earthquakes, sedimentary rocks, all that kind of stuff. Again, that can be related. I'm not saying that this person doesn't necessarily have insights into certain parts of the problem about global change, but is this person qualified to make big sweeping statements about the validity of climate change? Almost certainly not. Person number 8 here, his degree is a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology from Penn State. That means he's had, about 10 classes in different aspects of weather, but doesn't necessarily mean he has any knowledge about climate whatsoever. He may literally not have even taken one class about climate. Okay? And that's just the first 8 of 125. I went through the whole list of 125, including the people who I know. And I mean, the people who are on the list who I know, I respect quite a bit, and I really think they're very valuable in the things that they study. But the people who I know who are on this list also aren't climate scientists, and it's kind of silly that they are signing these kinds of letters. Now, in fairness, some of the people who sign these letters, as I mentioned, are in fact experts on some aspect of the problem of climate change. Not every single one of these people has no background whatsoever in climate change. They might be experts on like how climate change is affecting some insect population. Or they might be some expert, and maybe in their research, well, it seems like the insects aren't changing all that much, but that doesn't mean they're able to make a decision more broadly about is climate change happening. I mean, for these people, the tragedy here is that their opinions are relevant, but to parts of the problem. But they unfortunately jeopardize their careers and their standing and so on in the field by trying to make sweeping judgments about the broader issues of climate change rather than understanding their part of the piece is a small part of the larger puzzle. That's a real problem. In fact, I want to stick with what the book actually says. I want to use the actual words that the book uses on page 11. The book says, one argument that is frequently made is that there is in fact wide disagreement in the science of climate change among climate scientists. And as evident, they tend to point to these lists of scientists who dispute the views of the mainstream. However, a close evaluation of the dissident scientists on those lists reveals that in almost all cases they should not be considered experts on climates. Although many have technical degrees and some even doctorates, their specific training does not include climate change. They would never qualify as an expert witness in a lawsuit. They do not have the background to teach college-level courses on the material. I think we can say that that is true of all those first 8 we went through. And I'm going to tell you, I went through the whole list of 125. It was not pretty, okay? And you're certainly free to follow that link that I give you there and go look at that list yourself and look those people up. As your book says on page 11, the only reason that advocates of the opinion that climate change is not happening or it's not caused by people or whatever, the only reason that advocates put such transparently unqualified people forward as experts is that legitimate experts with their desired opinions, namely the opinion that climate change is not happening or not caused by people or whatever, are not available. In other words, there are no people out there with legitimate qualifications in the study of climate and climate change who have the opinions that people who put these lists together want. Thus, the lack of credentials of the people on these petitions actually underscores the strong agreement among the relevant experts on the science of climate change. The fact that you have to go digging around and finding retired chemistry professors and people who claim to be environmental consultants and so on these lists is because you can't find people with actual expertise in climate change who have these opinions. Or very, very few. Oh, that is not what the people who advocate these kinds of opinions want you to know. Claiming that there is a lack of consensus among the scientific community is false. On the other hand, it is a way to diminish the claims that people who make claims about climate change make. I mean, yeah, if you think that the scientists aren't agreeing, that the science isn't in, it's easy to be dismissive of claims that we need to make changes in how we are, burning fossil fuels and so on. Except that lack of consensus isn't really there. There is consensus. That's interesting. Another way that we often see where people with certain kinds of political agendas are trying to undermine climate science is to claim that scientists somehow find ways to benefit from the sense that there is a crisis about climate. I mean, people will say things like, scientists just want more funding, or scientists just want more prestige, or this is just all about forcing some kind of social agenda on us. By the way, I should tell you, this goofy picture here of the people who I don't accept fundamental tenets of science and I vote, I'm pretty sure this image is fake, okay? I think this is a website where you can type in and it'll put the image on, the words on the sign for you, okay? Sadly, the one beforehand about carbon dioxide is not a pollutant and stuff like that, I think that one's real. I found that one in a newspaper. This other one was just too funny to pass up. I don't think it's real though, okay? Okay. What about this business that scientists are somehow creating a crisis because somehow it benefits us? Well, you could ask that about any science. Any science could create a crisis or fabricate a crisis and somehow benefit from it if this would work, and yet it's never happened in the history of science. Medical science has never told us there's a disease out there, here by this medicine, when there is no such disease. Chemistry has never created crises like that. Physics has never created crises like that. It wouldn't work. I mean, for example, how would you get all these different scientists to agree to participate in such a fraud? I mean, I like what the book actually says here on page 12. It says, climate science is a large, diverse, and intensely competitive endeavor, and the desire to outthink one's peers and show that one is smarter than they are is much greater than the incentive to cooperate in this type of fraud. See, here's the deal. Being the bestest and the smartest is what scientists want. And if there was some reason to think other scientists were wrong about this climate change thing, that's what scientists would want to prove. I mean, if you think you could get these, I don't know what I got there, 6 scientists that are sitting there in that picture there to agree to participate in a fraud, yeah, the problem is this guy's immediately going to go, oh man, discrediting your crap ideas is going to feel so good. And this guy over here is going to say, I am way smarter and better educated than this old man. And this lady over here is going to say, I'll show them, then they'll listen to me. Yeah, you can't get them all to agree to participate in some kind of fraud. The incentives are there for them to want to outthink each other and to be smarter than each other and so on. They're not going to participate in some fraud that somehow makes the whole discipline get more money. And besides, it's a complete misunderstanding to think that somehow the research dollars end up in the researchers' pockets. That isn't how the funding system works at all. And it's a sufficiently serious misunderstanding that you see all the time online and hear all the time on talk radio and so on, that it's worth spending a few minutes on this. How does the research funding system work so that we don't get into this kind of situation where scientists are somehow making up crises so that you'll give them more money? It's actually explained fairly well in your textbook, but I want to kind of fill in a few gaps here. In the case of climate science, there's basically 3 sources of public research funding. Federal agencies that have a mandate from Congress to provide funding to scientists in the United States who are doing research on climate. That would be the National Science Foundation, the NSF, or the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which is NOAA, or the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, NASA. There are a few others that have small mandates to work on particular regional issues or something, but these are the three main federal agencies that give money, that use their authorizations from Congress to provide resources to study climate. Congress tells them they do that. It is part of the budget appropriation and so on, the reauthorization of these agencies and so on, that they have to spend a certain amount of their resources addressing certain kinds of fundamental science issues like climate change. And they do it in a number of different ways. Like, for example, each of these agencies actually operates research labs, where they hire scientists whose full-time job is to work on certain kind of research problems. Okay, all three of these agencies run various kinds of research labs that work this way. Those scientists who work there do not get paid more if they find information about climate change, but paid less. They don't get fired if they can't find information about climate change. That isn't the way it works. It's just their job. Assessing data, learning about new data sets, consolidating, combining the work of different studies to figure out what they mean, etc. This is just their full-time basic employment if they work at these research labs. That's usually not what certain kind of talk radio hosts or certain kind of bloggers are getting their self all upset about. What they're usually worried about is about the money that goes to researchers outside of those research labs. See, each of these agencies issues what are called calls for proposals, in which researchers at different universities can write proposals to be funded. You can write up a proposal where you say, hey, these are the kinds of questions I'm going to try to answer. This is the techniques I'm going to use. These are the data I'm going to use. This is my qualifications, etc. It's a huge document you provide that you can ask for financial support from the National Science Foundation or from NOAA or NASA or whatever to help support the cost of your research. And one of the things you have to do is you have to put together a very detailed budget as to how you would spend the money that you are asking these federal agencies for. And you can use that money for things like equipment and supplies. That could be as prosaic as things like paper and computers and pens and stuff like that. Or it could be very specific stuff like, if you were an astronomer, you might need telescopes. Or if you are a chemist, you might need particular chemicals or whatever. In the case of climate change, maybe you need supercomputers that are going to be performing the calculations of the models. We're going to be learning about that later in the semester. You can use the money, if it's budgeted that way, for things like staff. Maybe you need to have some specialists on staff to run specialized equipment. Maybe you have to hire some grad students to help with the research, etc. We're going to learn more about later in the course about how publication works, but there are costs associated with publication. And nobody expects you to pay those out of pocket. Okay, if you write research that other scientists, if you create research that other scientists should know about and you need to write a publication about that, there's a lot of costs associated with that. And public funding sources like NSF and NASA and NOAA are willing to help with those costs. But it's the stipend that people worry about. Okay, yes, the university researcher who is doing research can receive a stipend as part of the budget of a proposed research project. But here's the deal. The amount of money that the researcher can budget for his stipend is actually tightly controlled and very limited. In fact, it's so limited that many times funding agencies will specifically require that the researcher receive no stipend at all for doing the proposed research. That has happened to me several times. In the course of my career, where I've written a proposal asking for support, I needed some computers, or I needed some data sets, or I needed some piece of equipment, or I needed a grad student, and I'd write a proposal that I'm doing certain kind of work here, then it's happened several times that, as a requirement for the funding, they had to agree I get no stipend whatsoever for that. Okay, I will be doing that work effectively for free. Okay, that is what it is. They want to make sure that there's no appearance of wrongdoing. Even if a stipend is allowed, it's typically extremely limited. It's usually limited to, this is a weird formula, but it's usually limited to 10-50 seconds of the researcher's normal pay, which took out to 19%. So you can still be paid for working for the university, and you can ask the NSF to give you a stipend equal to as much as 19% of what you make. That number did not just get pulled out of nowhere. The way it works is technically most scientists who work at a university work for the university 9 months out of the year. And then they can propose to have NASA or NSF or whatever give them a stipend for the summer, which would be 12 out of 52 weeks of the year, but the process assumes you'll take 2 weeks of that off for vacation. So instead of being a 12 out of 52, it's 10 out of 52, or 19% of your salary. You can ask for that, okay? Now, so like let's say you're a researcher who happens to make, let's just say $50,000 for round numbers. Okay, then if you are writing a proposal to NSF or NASA or NOAA or whatever, you could write in your budget to get as much as 19% of your $50,000 as paid for your summer. Strictly speaking, that $50,000 is paid for the 9 months of the school year, and then you can ask for them to fill in 10 of the weeks of the summer like that, which would work out to $9,600 before taxes. Your take home is probably about $5,000. You're probably you're one of the few people in the world who could do this research that's important, that you want the federal government to help support, and you're making a big $5,000 for having done it. Okay? The money is not really all that much that scientists get. And here's the deal. That 19%, that 10 over 52, that's actually the hard and fast maximum you can even ask for. Typically, if you ask for that much in a research grant, the funding agency is going to ask the university to make some kind of concessions. For example, the university, the federal agency will say, okay, if we're giving him this much money, he really needs more time during the school year. We'll only give you that much money if you can give us a letter in return that your university is going to have you teach fewer classes next year so you have more time to finish this work, or something like that. Well, in general, universities aren't going to agree to that. They're generally not going to let you out of teaching so that you can finish up a project that you're doing for a federal agency. Okay, so it's actually much more common for a researcher to ask for something like 4 52nds of their salary, like equivalent to 4 weeks of their salary or 2 weeks of their salary. You know, their actual take home on a research project that, you know, they're a world expert on that subject might be, I know I've had projects that I've taken home. You know, my summer stipend for doing that work was like $1,500 or something. I mean, you're not doing it for the money. So the money that the researcher receives is at best a very small incentive. The money is not the issue. I understand that it sounds like a lot of money when you hear that this is a $10 million research project. But that doesn't mean the researcher gets $10 million. That means that there is $10 million worth of that telescope that they have to put together, that research aircraft that they're going to be flying. They don't buy a research craft, or you rent it and all this kind of stuff. But I mean, when you hear about these big projects, nobody got all that money. They got a very small sliver of that money, at least that the researcher. In other words, what I'm trying to say and what your author of your textbook is trying to say here is fabricating some kind of climate crisis so that you could get public funding and put it in your pocket is not going to work. Okay, that's just, the system is designed to make sure that doesn't happen. At the very most, you're going to get a small sliver of your salary for doing this work. And like I said, many, maybe most federal projects nowadays require that the main researcher actually get no stipend at all. That way there's no appearance of wrongdoing, that they're doing this for the money. Wow, that's probably pretty amazing. You probably didn't know that that's how that worked. Kind of makes this whole idea that somehow other scientists are doing this because they're going to get, you know, more research dollars sounds kind of silly, doesn't it? Okay, this is the end then of this lecture. Let me just real quick have you answer 2 more questions. Again, we don't record these answers or anything. They just help you understand how well you understood the material, give you an example of the kind of questions we can answer, and so on. All right, question number 3. To truly be considered an expert in a field, A, you need to stay up to date with current information and research. B, you need to have retired from a long and distinguished career in the field. C, you need to have written books on the topic. And D, you need to agree with your colleagues. Okay, I think that's actually a fairly hard question. So follow one of the 4 links below this video to show me your answer to that question, and I'll give you a little feedback before we move on to question 4.